Hello everyone, this is Ashley Tucker. Thank you for joining me today. Today I have a really easy watercolor Christmas card to share with you. This kind of watercoloring I think anybody could do no matter what your skill level. The paper that I'm going to be using for this is the Arches cold pressed watercolor paper. This is a really nice quality watercolor paper. It's very textured and it is a little bit pricier than other watercolor paper. If you can't afford this one, it's totally fine to go with something like the Canson watercolor paper. You can also use whatever watercolor set you have on hand already. I'm going to be using my Altenew set because it has some really nice greens in it. So as you can see, I taped down my piece of cold pressed Arches watercolor paper down to a board. I did cut that piece to be just a little bit bigger than 5x7 because I wanted to make a 5x7 card. Right here you can see that I mixed up my first color. Now this color is a little bit more on the blue side. I used blue and green, but I used quite a bit of blue because I wanted these first trees to be more blue. I also added quite a bit of water to this color because I want it to be extremely light. These trees are going to be far off in the distance in my painting, so I want them to be hardly there. The paintbrushes that I use are the Royal and Langnickel paintbrushes. You can find them on Simon Says Stamp. And this first paintbrush size that I'm using for these back trees is the number 8 paintbrush. So like I said, these first couple trees are in the background of the painting. They're pretty far away and they're going to be a little bit less noticeable, so they don't have to be completely perfect. And actually, that's kind of the really great thing about painting evergreen trees. You can be a little bit messy with them and they'll still look really good. Like Bob Ross says, there are no mistakes, just happy little accidents. And painting trees always kind of makes me feel like Bob Ross. If you don't know who Bob Ross is, then please go watch some Bob Ross videos on YouTube. He's amazing. I watch his videos every night while I go to sleep. His voice is just so soothing and I love watching him paint. Okay, so for the first 2 trees that I painted, they were extremely light. And then for the next 2 after them, I just added a little bit more pigment to the color that I already had. So they're just a little bit darker. And for this tree that I'm doing right now, I wanted it to be just as dark as the 2 trees that I did before it. I didn't want it to be a whole lot darker, but I did want it to be green instead of that bluish green color. So what I did was I added some green to my mix as well as some water, and that's what gave me this nice green color. And one thing that I definitely want to mention is that before I color a tree on top of another tree, I make sure that that first tree is completely dry. This next color that I'm mixing up has a lot more pigment in it. I wanted it to be a lot darker than the other colors that I've used because now we're starting to get to the front of our painting. So the further towards the front these trees are, the darker they get. I also switched to a number 4 paintbrush instead of the number 8 because I want to be able to do a little bit more detailed work with my painting. You're going to be able to see a little bit better now how I paint these trees now that it is a little bit darker. So the way that I start my tree is by painting a straight line down that's a little bit thinner on the top. After that, I start adding all of these messy curved lines that come from the center of the tree on both sides. With the lighter trees in the background, using the bigger paintbrush, these curved lines all kind of mix together and it's really not detailed, but that's okay because they're in the background, so there's not going to be as much detail. I do find that these trees tend to look better when I'm not overthinking where I place these lines, when I'm just kind of placing them a little bit messy and not trying to be perfect, because trees in nature aren't perfect. So if you make your trees on the painting look perfect, it's not going to look natural. For this particular color that I mixed up, I did do 3 different trees. Now for the next tree that I'm going to do, I forgot to turn the camera on when I was mixing up the color. But I'm going to tell you, I just added a lot of yellow and really light green to it because I wanted a tree that was kind of bright. Now, although this tree is brighter, it is still going to be one of the darker trees because it has a lot of pigment in it. If you're struggling to make these really pigmented colors when you're mixing up your colors, it might be that you're adding too much water to your paint. The more water that you add, the lighter it's going to be. So just try to add a little bit less water and a little bit more paint to get a super pigmented color. You can also take your color directly from the paint instead of mixing it on a palette, and this will give you as pigmented of a color as you can get. For these next trees that I'm making, I want to go even darker. So I'm mixing up a color right now and I'm adding a lot of pigment to this. I'm trying to get it really dark. I also mixed up a tiny amount of this dark brown color, which I added a tiny bit of green to as well. And I'm going to use this brown color to make my trunk. Now, when I did this trunk, I accidentally added a second line there a little bit in the middle, but that's okay because I can cover that up when I start to add the green. Now, the reason that I used the brown color for the trunk on this tree is we are getting even closer towards the front of our painting, so even more details can be seen. So the detail that can be seen on this tree that you couldn't see on other trees is the color brown in the trunk of the tree. Now I'm going to go a little bit crazy here and make some really, really dark colors. Now I couldn't add more pigment to this to make it darker. I had kind of already added as much pigment as I could. So the way that I made it darker this time was by adding black. And actually I did mix up 2 different colors here. One of them is really, really dark and one of them is a little bit lighter with a little bit more green in it. For this tree, I'm using the lighter of the 2 dark colors that I mixed up. I wanted this tree to be a little bit smaller. I don't want to lose all of the painting that I did in the background. And also because this is such a dark color, I don't want to make a giant tree and have it kind of swallow up the whole painting. Now, for this next tree that I'm doing, I am going to add in quite a bit of that darker of the 2 colors because this tree is on top of a pretty dark tree. And so I want to make it stand out a little bit more by adding the darker color. If I didn't make this tree really dark and it was very similar to the tree behind it, they would kind of blend together and it also wouldn't look like this tree is in front of it. Alright, so that was the last tree. Once it was dry, I can trim this down for my card. This is always a little bit sad to cut up your painting that you just did, but I did want a border around the edge on my card, so I ended up cutting that painting down to 4x6. For my sentiment, I picked the Merry Christmas stamp from My Favorite Things, and I'm using Versafine Onyx Black ink, which is a very juicy pigment ink, so it normally stamps really, really crisp sentiments. But because this is a really, really textured watercolor paper, it did take a lot of stamping to get a nice crisp sentiment, so it's really good to use the MISTI tool for this. I added some foam tape to the back of this panel and I popped it up onto a 5x7 card base. I didn't want to add too much else to this card because I wanted it to be kind of simple and for the painting to be the focus, but I did add a few gold and clear sequins. Here's a look at the finished card. I hope you really enjoyed this card design and that it gave you some ideas. I hope you'll give this kind of painting a shot. I honestly think that anybody can do this kind of painting, no matter your skill level with watercolor. I hope you have a wonderful day today, and I'll see you next time.